Hello class, this is John checking in once again. I want to pick up on some comments I didn't get to in class regarding the Western Vikings or the Western Norse. And in the interest of time, I'm going to click through some of the things that we have already covered. We talked about how really we're speaking of the impact and transformation and the development of Norse society, particularly as it pertains to Western Europe. And so when we use the phrase Western Vikings or the Western Norse, we're referring to the Danes and Norwegians, and remain mindful of the fact that there is an entire Norse and Viking experience that's happening in the eastern parts of Europe, and today what we would call Russia. Interestingly enough, the name Russia comes from the phrase Rus, which is actually a reference to the Norse people who were important settlers of the northern part of Central and East Asia. So we left off today. I believe we were here, and the point that I was making at the end of lecture was that, interestingly enough, in the case of the Western Vikings, part of what the role that trade accomplished was it made them aware of where wealth existed in pockets and concentration in other parts of the nearby world. So in places like England, the coast of Normandy, even over time as the Vikings pushed down around the west coast of Europe and into the Iberian Peninsula, they are learning, and not only are they trading in some instances, but they're also collecting notes for what will make the most sense in terms of pillage and plunder at future dates. And so that's not normally what we think of in terms of the role of trade, but in the case of the Vikings, trade actually sharpened, I guess you could say, even some of their barbaric behavior. So that merchant traffic is an important part of their overall modes of production. Also, they have this thing that we could call a raid culture, and what's important about that is that, and we'll talk more about the political economy of the Norse in a little bit, but if you were a wealthy Norse tribal member, a Viking of some respect and clout, you in all likelihood owned a ship. We talked about the significance of the long ship and how it was both a status symbol. You could use that long ship to further strengthen your claim to power and prestige within Norse society. And one of the ways you would do that would be by organizing and leading a raid expedition. The other thing that serves you well here is that not only do you get a disproportionate amount of the wealth that is plundered from a given raid, but you're also able to bring other less powerful, less prestigious Norse or Vikings under your patronage, because they're dependent upon you for your boat, and also you are distributing the wealth and plunder in a way that reinforces your power. So the raid culture is pretty critical, and it also serves to keep the Vikings in a constant state of preparation and readiness for raiding and pillaging and plundering. Now, population pressure is also another important consideration here, because oftentimes the movements of trade and migration out of Norway and Denmark are going to be driven by the growing population and population pressure that exists sort of in the Norse homeland. And so think of these Norse homelands. We talked about how, they're obviously Norway and Denmark have a decent amount of land, but the challenge is not all of it is arable, and arable is just a fancy word for farmable. And so there is a constant interest by successive generations of Norse people, much like there are in other societies around the world, to go find new lands to colonize, sort of as a release valve for some of the population pressure that's building back in the Norse homelands, particularly in the 7th and 8th centuries. So we start to see them moving out. Not altogether unlike some of the ways in which the ancient Greeks would move out and colonize new islands or new coasts within the Mediterranean system as their population pressure grew. The Viking calendar, this is sort of a useful quote from an archaeologist who has spent time studying the Vikings, and this gives you a sense of the seasonality. And I think what's important here is from a mode of production standpoint, you can see that the Vikings had certain parts of the year where they would behave like pretty well-behaved, quote-unquote, civilized, a civilized society. And in other times, again, part of their mode of production to go out and conquer and take. So in some cases they planted, they sowed their fields and then harvested. But oftentimes in between there were seasons while their crops were growing. They would go off and enrich themselves at the expense of other societies that had the misfortune of being located somewhere in the Baltic, North Sea, or Atlantic littoral zones. Okay, here's a stamp that I like. It sort of shows some of the various modes of production employed by the Norse people. Also gives you a pretty good sense of their landscape, a little bit of the fjord landscape, although this is pretty mellow. This is kind of right along the coast. You can just imagine, if you will, as you get closer to the interior of this landmass, things are going to get more, the landscape will become much more rigid and broken and difficult to navigate. Okay, and then I'll close with this slide. So the Viking cultural footprint. So this shows you a little bit some of the directions in which the Norwegian and Danish Norse scattered throughout this important time of the 7th through 9th centuries. And you can see that they are going to come in contact with some pretty important nearby regions, both in the British Isles, but also along the European mainland. And this is what we call the coast of Normandy, which of course is famous for its role during the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, toward the end of World War II. But this shows a nice sort of flow of the areas that the Western Vikings came in contact with. And they had a variety of different approaches to how they would settle or interact with the regions or societies that they came in contact with. First off, there were tributary settlements where the Norse would oftentimes demonstrate their superior military force, and if a settlement or society were willing to surrender in a fairly timely or early way, the Norse might just leave that society in place and then just choose to charge the occasional tributary payment for the sake of, kind of bringing that society under the umbrella of the Western Vikings. In other cases, the Norse would settle and then turn a society into a commercial entrepot, meaning a place of exchange where the people who live there would gather resources, crops, agriculture from the interior, and then it would be sold along the coast. And the Vikings, the Norse could, charge taxes, could charge, in kind. In some ways, this could also be a tributary type situation. Or the Vikings, the Norse might just feel like, you know what, we're doing fine on just taxing this and having this as part of our realm. We don't need to take more than a minimum amount, because the more productive this area is, the more we gain revenue. And then I reference here opportunism. Sometimes the act of settlement would then allow for greater raids in the nearby area, and sometimes the raids themselves would turn on, discovery moments of Eureka, where the Norse would say, hey, you know what? It's fun plundering and pillaging here, but this would also be a pretty good place for some next generation Norse to settle in and start anew. And so it was a number of different, I guess you could say, business plans that would sometimes hatch, but all these business plans, these different ways of treating, largely from an economic standpoint, the new areas that the Norse came in contact with, these had the impact of spreading the Norse cultural footprint. But it's also worth noting that not only did the Norse change the economies and modes of production of the places that they came in contact with, but they also were changed themselves. They adopted some of the cultural impacts. And one great example of this will be Christianity, because as the Vikings settle, as they do in the 10th and 11th centuries on the mainland, they're going to become, in many ways, interwoven with Christian Europe. Okay, and I've already talked about the monasteries, which were such a lucrative source of plunder for the Norse or the Western Vikings, who were hitting monasteries all throughout the regions shown on this map, whether they were in Ireland, England, parts of the Frankish Empire, around to the south, even into Muslim lands. Of course, there weren't a whole lot of monasteries in the Islamic world, but they could also hit some mosques and other wealthy parts of the Islamic world. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you.